Good afternoon, everyone. It's Pablo Zuanic, Cannabis Equity Analyst at Zuanic and Associates. I have the pleasure to welcome you to a Zoom panel to discuss the outlook for the Florida market, especially what happens with the ballot on November 5th and what happens after that, right? We have three speakers. Robert Groesbeck, he's the co-CEO of Planet 13 Holdings. We have Robert Beasley, CEO of Cansortium Inc., two operators in Florida, Cansortium and Planet 13. And we also have Michael Minardi, a leading attorney in the cannabis field, not only in Florida, but also in other parts of the US. So welcome to the three speakers.
Thank you for having us on.
Thank you.
So I'll start with you, Michael. First, let's just make some introductions. So tell us about your practice and your role specifically in Florida cannabis.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Pablo. Pleasure to be back with you again. Michael Minardi, I became an attorney to help legalize this years ago. And so I've been an advocate about 20 years now in the state. It's so wonderful to see all the developments that have occurred and all the businesses and, influx of cannabis and use and acceptance here in the state of Florida for the past 20 years. I do a lot of criminal defense and I do a lot of business setup and civil litigation.
Thank you. Rob Beasley, I'll start with you. Tell us about your company and remind us of your broader strategy and the state of your business overall.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you for having me on. I'm Robert Beasley. I'm the CEO of FLUENT. I became the CEO of a cannabis company to avoid continuing to be an attorney, and was helpful to get this position in 2020. Been at the helm of FLUENT now through its growth years. We have grown tremendously in Florida. We now are up to 35 stores. We're number 6 in the state as far as total THC milligrams, and continue to grow with 5 more stores on the horizon and another facility which comes live in January. We also are in Pennsylvania with a retail presence there. We are in Texas, one of 3 in Texas, so that's its own subject matter for a whole different podcast of what's going on in Texas. And we've recently acquired Etain through Riv Capital in New York under an merger agreement that is anticipated to close, I'd call it mid-November now. So a lot of growth on our side, exciting new markets for us. New York represents our first AU market, which is an exciting new dynamic.
Great, thank you. Robert Groesbeck from Planet 13 Holdings.
Yeah, thank you, Pablo. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Planet 13 is a Nevada-based company that recently expanded into Florida, and in a big way. It's a big opportunity for us here. We also do business in California, and then we've got retail operation in Illinois, in the city of Waukegan. So we're excited about November, see what happens here, and I think Florida's got a tremendous amount of upside, as Robert indicated. There's a lot of growth here. Many of the operators are looking to locate additional locations in anticipation of Question 3 passing. So again, we're excited to be part of that, and happy to dive into specifics.
Sure, thank you, Robert. So Michael, let's start with you. I mean, the first question for the three of you, of course, your expectations where the ballot passes, and what do you base your assumptions on? Let's start with that. Michael, you first.
Well, I definitely do think it is going to pass. I know it's polling very closely. We have a high hurdle to get here in the state of Florida. But I think it's time, and I do think that we've been able to hopefully stop the misinformation provided by the No on 3 campaign. I know I've switched a few people's votes over the past couple weeks. So I do think we're going to get over that 60% threshold. Absolutely.
Can you just expand on the misinformation? Give us some examples, please.
The No on 3 campaign is campaigning about it's smelling like cannabis everywhere. They're working against these guys and blaming the monopolies and saying it's only going to benefit the monopolies. They're saying it's going to get into, tons more kids' hands, and we're going to have all these problems with kids, getting access to it and stuff like that as a result of it. So, it's the continued same rhetoric that they have over year after year in trying to fight first against medical, and then now they added this other stuff in for legalization.
Michael, I'm sorry, I'm going to stay with you there. I mean, given your, of course, expertise and years in the Florida field, who would carry more weight in terms of opinion? Donald Trump's or Governor DeSantis here in terms of influencing voters, in your view?
Well, it is about the Republican vote in a big part because we know pretty much all the Dems are going to vote, yes on three. So I hope it does have great weight, and I know that the young Republicans are working with the yes on three campaign, and I know for my campaign for office in 2022 as a Republican Party, we had probably about 46 to 50% support when we were in the polls and sort of the mailers that we did and the responses that we got back in support of legalization. So I do think that hopefully Trump as well doesn't hurt the cause at all. And I think the rhetoric that DeSantis is even putting out isn't seeming like he's saying, well, it's totally bad. He's using a monopoly. He's using it smelling like cannabis and things as excuses. And he has previously also said that he doesn't believe people should be in jail for it. So, he can't have his cake and eat it too. And I think it's time that we pass it here in the state of Florida.
Thank you. So, Robert Groesbeck, same question for you. Your expectations about the ballot, and what do you base that on? But also, how would your strategy change depending on the ballot results in Florida?
Yeah, I'll defer to Michael on his connectivity to the electorate here. I'm a relative newcomer, but I too am guardedly optimistic. I talk to people in our stores every day. I just talk to regular folks, what they're thinking, and it seems like people, a significant majority above that 60%, at least people we're communicating with, are optimistic that it'll pass and they're going to support the initiative. It just makes sense, and I think a lot of this 11th hour banter coming out from the opposition is just that. It's not getting a lot of resonance, and it's 11th hour squawking, and this monopoly thing I think is really kind of silly. But as an industry, we should have anticipated that. We have, and we'll let the voters decide. Again, we're operating under the premise that it is going to pass, right, and we're going to gear up accordingly. Obviously, if it doesn't pass, we're still in the state. We're still active. Our goal is to continue to add stores. We're currently at 28. We should have at least 32 open by the end of the year. But we see a real, a continued acceleration there, even if it were just medical. But it's a game changer if it goes to adult use. And, I think we all recognize that the upside there is significant. And it's now just a question of getting positioned for that. And the other thing that I think, doesn't get a lot of attention, but it should, is, we've got another 22 licenses out there that will issue at some point. So it's going to be interesting to see how this dynamic plays out, assuming, again, that we have a favorable result in November, but, how that rolls out with the additional licenses that will hit the market.
Thank you. Robert Beasley, same question. Your expectations for the ballot, what do you base that on, and how will your strategy change depending on the results of the ballot?
So since starting the tracking of this, watching the polls and such, it's polling in the mid 60s already. And so that's a good indication that it would pass. My feeling has been, early on when asked about this, I was 50-50 on it getting certified by the court because of the revised standards on the Supreme Court on certification. And so I called that one the other way, and it did get certified, and I was happy to be wrong. And then I have always felt like it would pass. Two factors that lead to me is the fact that it's a presidential year, and that race had died out until, of course, the bringing in of Kamala Harris, and now it's a real race. And so, that's going to bring bodies to the polls, and that, to get in the 60%, you just need mass. Secondly is the abortion issue. It's a red hot issue. People are not going to ignore it. They're going to show up for that, and that's going to help get us the critical mass we need. So it'll pass. My concern then turns to, because I'm a consummate worrier, so what happens next? We go into a legislative implementation session there. There's a second, third paragraph of the current statute, and I remember it from the old days. It says the constitutional amendment's further amended than the existing statute sunsets. And so the program's not going to go away, but those who want to have a chip to play to be a part of a change, they're going to have that chip. They're going to say, well, we start over de novo with the statutory construction. I think there's a lot of sausage making that's going to happen in the legislature. A lot of what I've heard, THC caps, store caps, some of these things I actually can get behind if they're reasonably invoked. And so, we're going to be watching the legislative process on implementation. I think that process could take a while. And so what are we doing to prepare? Not much. We think that the passing is going to be the race to the starting line, which could be 18 to 24 months out. We do change how we locate our stores. We do have another facility coming on. All of that is supporting our constant growth in the existing medical market. We are geared and balanced to continue to grow in the existing market. This additional change of marketplace for us will be something we actually have to catch up for. We're not leading in anticipation of it. And so because my position is when it passes, it's a race to the starting line. We'll have time. And then also it's not going away. And so it's going to be here for a while. We already have a substantial footprint. And so we will catch it. And so our strategy is a little bit different. And that's because we continue to be successful in the existing market, despite the decreasing market share and the increasing competition for that share. So we like where we are. We'd love it to pass. If it doesn't, we're going to be fine. The real issue is what it does to that, the mention of the 22 licenses, coming into this state right now as one of those new potential licensees with the capital investment necessary to be fully vertical. It would be daunting. I would have a hard time even recommending someone try it with the amount of capital that's needed. And so it almost needs to pass before any additional licenses would have any kind of landscape to operate in.
Right. And then they probably have a 2-year window to really get started, right? Especially if it's greenfield. But just a couple of follow-ups there, Robert. In terms of the new facility, can you give us more color? Where's the location compared to your existing facility? Are you doubling capacity? Just in terms of what you can share. Brief answer.
Yeah, so we're in balance right now at 35 stores, and keeping an integrated system in balance is the key. And so we need to grow on the retail footprint. So therefore, we need to grow on the cultivation footprint. And the cultivation has to grow first because you can't put the store on the ground without anything to sell. And so we're increasing capacity. It's by about a third. It's adjacent to the existing Tampa facility. It's phase one. We'll add about another 12,000 square foot, and then phase two another 20. So we'll be about another 32, all high quality flower output, indoor type small batch scenario. And so, when we grow, we like to grow in balance, but then we also like grow mission specific. So when we grow a facility or we bring on another facility, we think about first, like which the mission output of that facility, and making sure we're putting the lowest dollar cost into the growing whatever the mission output is. For instance, if extractable material versus fresh frozen versus high quality flower. And so this will be a high quality flower facility because our last growth step was in a greenhouse facility, which is more extractable material. So this growth, by the way, is just to keep up with our growth in the medical market. We do have a contingency plan for growth in the rec market or the adult use market. It's a whole different property that we haven't yet taken down. We're still under due diligence.
Thank you for that. Michael, just moving on to Robert touched on it, but in terms of implementation, so let's say we get the 60% plus vote. There's a scenario that recreational sales start with existing program, operators get grandfather, and everything starts May 5th. Other people don't agree with that date, and they say it would start 2026. Can you talk about that and talk about how much things can change? How much does the governor and the legislature, how much influence would they have in the new program, like Robert said, de novo, or are we pretty much using the current program?
So, interesting questions on that one. So number one, the amendment does call for and gives the department 6 months to create rules to be able to apply for adult use or establish the adult use system. So technically and realistically, what happened when we passed medical via the amendment, the MMTCs at that point in time pretty much almost immediately started selling to patients under the new law. Technically, the amendment itself effectuating the first Tuesday of the month, it becomes effective. So at that point in time, technically the amendment is effective. The amendment in it has writing and wording for that 6-month period to give the legislature to set up the establishment program. The legislature really doesn't have to do anything if they don't want to. because at the end of that 6 months, the way I see it, and the way the Supreme Court of Florida said it in reviewing the ballot initiative, and I think they were much more aggressive than I expected. But MMTC should be at that 6 month period be able to sell cannabis to adults 21 plus, regardless of whether or not the legislature acts. So I don't think they could necessarily stop these entities from selling it. The Supreme Court opinion said that they should be able to do it immediately, from the way I read it. So,
Immediately
that'll
meaning
be the
like
question.
post-ballot or immediately May 5th?
When it's effective. So the effective date technically of the amendment is I think it's the first Tuesday or second Tuesday of January or something of that nature. So that's when technically the amendment is effective for the state of Florida.
So just to follow up on that, so there is a scenario, even though maybe unlikely, that you will have rec sales beginning in January, based on what you're saying?
Hey, if you read the Supreme Court, they use the word immediately. Again, the amendment does state, and I think the entities would get approval from the department before they did anything, but the amendment states it's a 6 month period. But, the amendment last time, when we passed medical, it said a 6 month period too. And all of the MMTCs were selling within a couple months, to all patients who were approved under Amendment 2. And I was jumping up and down and be like, this is illegal. How can they do that? They have to establish a system. And the department was okay with it. So I don't know what's going to happen, but again, you talked about the governor, really he would have big implementation over that because he is the executive branches of the Department of Health, and the Department of Health and what their position is on it. So, and again, their main position is that, the monopolies, and again, DeSantis is the one that's sitting on the issuance of those 22 extra licenses.
Yeah.
So he's arguing that, don't vote on it because it only benefits a few companies, but, it could benefit almost 50 throughout the state if they issue those licenses. So
So to be clear,
implementation is going to be
let me just to
tough.
follow up there on a couple of points. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's say the ballot passes, right, more than 60%. According to the Supreme Court, could be as early as January. Governor, the legislature have 6 months to implement the program, May 5th. There's a scenario said that they do nothing. If they do nothing, supposedly the medical operators can start selling rec right away, May 5th. But given everything that's happened, right, you would think that the governor and the legislature will want to implement some rules and come out with a new program. And I don't know if they will, and do they have really until May 5th, or could they take longer if they want to? Any thoughts on that from your side, Mike?
Realistically, the legislature, that session will be it's a non-election year, so the legislature is from March to May. So they'll be in session from March to May before that 6 month period. If we go back and look at medical, what happened with medical is they ended up having to have a special session after the regular session in order to get medical implemented. So realistically, that's why the amendment's written that way, that they have the 6 months. They know it falls within that legislative, session period, because we only have a 65-day legislature plus, committee hearings and stuff like that a couple months before. So realistically, it should be done and complete, no problem through that. There's really not much they necessarily have to do in order to turn this on.
And I'm sorry, before I pass it on to the other speakers, so in the scenario that they don't complete the potential new rules by the end of the legislative period, you're saying they will have dropped the ball and the MTCs could start rec sales by May 5th.
So I would say June 5th, 6 months from January.
Oh, it's not from November 5th?
Nope, it would be from effective date of the amendment. So I would say June 5th. Again, it's a constitutional amendment. So when we talk about, and they mentioned it, we called it the poison pill when we were doing our initiatives and stuff like that, that it would technically abolish the current MMTC system. But it would abolish the legislative aspect of the MMT system. So what we would then have is kind of what I would call a free-for-all that I don't think our legislature would ever want. Because the amendment, the constitutional amendment, would still allow for medical marijuana and still allow for patients to access it and require, them to allow patients to access it. So 6 months out, June 5th, the latest, I think MMTCs should be able to sell. Whether or not there's delays and these companies have to sue the department to make sure that happens, I don't know.
Right.
But the governor has constantly said he's not going to go against the will of the people.
Okay. So look, Robert Groesbeck or Robert Beasley,
Yeah.
who wants to follow up on that? Robert Groesbeck, go ahead.
No, look, I hope Michael's right. I'm liking what I'm hearing. I've just unfortunately been in a number of jurisdictions where things haven't quite panned out according to what the intent was. So, lawyers being lawyers, and me being a former or recovering lawyer, it seems like there's always a mad rush to the courthouse when either amendments like this pass or new licenses enter the market. So, if it happens in that time frame, fantastic. We'll be excited to embrace that. But we're going to be a bit more guarded and see what happens on the legislative front and see what the attorneys come up with.
Right, but before I pass it on, Robert Groesbeck, how would they stall? I mean, how would they delay it? What could they do to delay it, in your opinion?
Well, I look, and again, I'm just reading the tea leaves, but I've been in a number of markets where we've thought just that. Oh well, this is set in stone. The legislation is absolutely clear. When it turns out it's anything but. And I can't tell you what some creative lawyer is going to do on behalf of a class of aggrieved or alleged aggrieved parties. We'll wait and see. But I think what Michael says makes perfect sense, and I hope it follows through that way. But again, we'll get positioned to take advantage of that. But the world doesn't end if it doesn't happen June 2nd. Something will fall into place. Knowing politicians the way I do, they all want to get involved in some way. So my guess is there will be some interplay with the legislature for sure. That's just notwithstanding the fact that it's a constitutional question. So.
Right. Robert Beasley, your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, I too love what Michael is saying and his enthusiasm and such, and it's a great theoretical discussion, but there's a pretty vast landscape between a theoretical discussion and then the seat that I sit in, where we have to make economic decisions and base the future and the welfare of the company on that theory. And when we stretch out on build it and they will come, and the they part involves political influence and court systems and so forth, then it's not a safe bet. I've been in this system since the very, very beginning. I was on the original committees. And you got a department that has changed its face and dynamic with the leadership change. They are not a kinder, friendlier department now at this point. Everything they're doing is a little bit more aggressive towards its licensees since the regime change. We have a governor that is, I would say, on the right side of agnostic about our program and certainly does not want to see it grow. We have a legislature that wants to take shots at this opportunity. We have a department that hasn't followed the laws to start with. I mean, these 22 we keep talking about, if you want to go count the time in which it should have been entered and those should have been issued, all the lawyers on one side of the balance scale can't jump high enough to make them do what the law says they should have done already. And so, there's this presupposition that just because the law says it, that it's going to happen. I get it. I've played this game a while, but I can't bet the company's financial future on that. We have to see it coming. Now, within the scope of the licensees, there are some that are more aggressive. There are some that are more risk capable than we are. And I'd love to see some brave souls step out there on June 5 and start selling adult use cannabis in the state of Florida, but it won't be our stores. We will have good, clear guidance from the department that regulates us and the license that we're operating under, that we're able to legally do so before we do so.
Right. I'm going to follow up on that in terms of those other operators, but at the beginning you mentioned potential changes on potency and other things. I mean, can you expand on that? I mean, what are you hearing in terms of potential, nuances or changes to the program?
Sure. So there's some concerns in our state from the regulators that we hear. There's some concerns from these same groups that are opposing the amendment, the more reasonable ones that are opposing the amendment. Some of the opposition to the amendment I don't understand. There's this presupposition that there's a home grow that's going to be allowed and that we're somehow moving into that potential, which isn't even true. But the ones that are more reasonable, THC caps Our scientific ability to produce and trick this plant into producing THC is all-time high. I mean, we can make this plant come out in 32-34%, which is phenomenal if you think about it. There's some logical suggestions that maybe we ought to, be able to cap that. I could see that within reason, but it has to be like anything, a reasonable regulation. The number of stores, we've all watched California and Colorado and other states run away with open stores and basically following the tragedy of supply and demand, oversupply and not matching the demand. An existing operator, I don't want to see that. I want good, solid growth and healthy growth, but I don't want unchecked growth that then takes the market drivers away. So I could support a store cap, but what that number is needs to be fair, needs to be rationally related to some type of population dynamics, and it can't be a knee-jerk reaction by those who just want to use that as a mechanism to end the program. So there is ground for, it's a new program. We just started, right? And we just rolled it out. And now we've had a few years. Those of us have been doing it since 18, 19, 17, we can come back and look and go, yeah, we could see where it can be improved. Any model, any legislation, any contract is organic and can be improved with hindsight. But if it gets into that morass of political sausage making, then it could be dangerous for us. And so we got to pay attention and try to be good operators. Try to remember what this is all about, which is good, solid, safe, consumer safe products, and setting a reputation that defies the traditional wisdom about what cannabis is and what it can be.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I want to make a comment, and any one of you can chime in here. But if I think of Kim Rivers Trulieve, right? She's led the way against IRS regarding 280E rule, and most other companies have followed now. And I'm not going to expand on the subject because people know what I'm talking about. So she's been very proactive, and I think it's a good thing for the industry, at least temporarily or permanently, depending on how things play out. Regarding Florida, my read, of course, without speaking to her directly on this specific point, she's been expanding stores very aggressively recently, right? And I suppose she's expanding capacity to be able to fill those stores. The data shows that revenue per store for Trulieve remains flattish, which means good because they are adding more stores, so they have new capacity coming in. So it could be that, she's more on the Michael Minardi type of view, and she'll be out there selling adult from early on and challenging, the governor in the courts. And maybe the rest of the industry will follow. But I don't know. Anyone wants to comment on what I just said? Or am I pipe dreaming here?
I will say, I've known Kim for a long time, and, she's always been at the forefront, I think, about fighting this. They were one of the first entities that pushed the flower and stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised. They have so much skin in the game now at this point that they wouldn't do that. But and don't get me wrong, I 100% think our legislature and stuff will do everything that they can to try to limit, thwart this industry as much as possible. They're not big fans of it. And I know that there's already going to be a bill introduced, to prevent public smoking. I wouldn't exactly what Robert said. The cap issue we've seen multiple times already with the medical market.
Right.
Okay. And moving on, just a question about the state of the relationship between Governor DeSantis and the MSO industry, right? There's been some lawsuits back and forth. Anyone want to comment on that in terms of how can that may impact negotiations if the ballot passes? I know most of you have said he's agnostic, right? He will respect the will of the people. But, are we facing a DeSantis Disney type situation with cannabis?
Well, I don't want to put too much on the governor. I think that the governor has to be sensitive to, the will of the people, and by definition, that's kind of all of the people of Florida. And every Floridian is not in support of the existence or even growth of this program, and so I think he's trying to balance it. Having said that, I was there the first day that he announced it, and the very first day that he announced the passage of the program, he called it a monopoly. And a cartel. And so it doesn't sound like he's an advocate of growth of the program. Having said that, I've never seen him do anything overtly to hurt the program. The flip side of that is that we did have a departmental change in when he placed, I think someone he's more aligned with as the head of the department. The total tone of the department changed. They actually announced no more notices. We're going to start directly finding you. Everything takes 3 times as longer now to process. The amount of inspections and random, just the aggressiveness of the department has changed, and that happened when there was a regime change, and the regime change was accomplished by him. So I don't know that there's been a lot of overt actions by the governor, but certainly I think the undercurrent from his office is not supporting the growth. I don't know if he's trying to get rid of the program as much as the legislature, I think, is actually trying to work against the program, but we don't have a champion in either.
Okay. Anyone want to expand on the subject before I move on? No? Okay.
Well, I'll probably defer to my colleagues. They've obviously been boots on the ground here for some time, and I'm relatively new to this side of it, so I appreciate their comments.
Okay, thank you. Now, on the same topic, we have the hemp industry, right? The hemp advocates seem to be very well organized. From my perspective, they seem to have the governor's ear, right? They were able to get him to veto the ban. They are very proud of talking, having gone to Tallahassee and pretty much persuading him to ban the veto on hemp derivatives. They are, in a recent conference, they were talking about the potential for the governor, the legislature to come out with joint rules for a joint program of cannabis and hemp derivatives. But how does, the whole hemp lobby here play into things? Or it's just different rails, don't mix them up? Michael, any thoughts on that?
I do a lot of thoughts on that because I've worked with a lot of these hemp companies, and I also have done a bunch of these Amendment 3 panels and debated some of these hemp companies regarding their stances to no on 3. And how that whole thing came to play was very interesting, and it was really the belief that these entities were pushing the legislation for the regulations on hemp, and so that's how that marriage occurred. DeSantis was kind of like, well, you guys, donate to my No on 3 campaigns, and I'll veto this legislation, and that came out with like text messages and stuff, it seems. So the hemp companies were afraid that they were going to be put out of business. And I will say the legislation that was going to pass would have put a lot of companies out of business. I think that they have to more worry about the federal issue at this point, because it looks like the feds are going to be moving towards, regulating intoxicating hemp products. But that's how this situation occurred and happened. And I do expect that there to be additional bills this legislative session at the guidance of DeSantis on regulation of the hemp industry here in Florida a little bit more.
Anyone else on the subject on hemp and their cloud?
The whole subject in total across the country is fascinating, and it's really a legislative failure. The hemp industry is not evil or wrong or anything. First of all, the cannabis plant doesn't know what it is, right? We tell it what it is, whether it's hemp or otherwise. And so we're all growing the same materials. The 2010 Farm Bill creates this loophole for them to move forward in that industry versus our industry. This was all man-made and man-contrived, and their politics were better through agriculture in Congress back in the day in 2010, and so the real issue is that they've managed to grow in an unregulated fashion. And what I have asked over and over again is just get regulated, just come into the light with us. And let's remember what I said earlier. It's really about the consumer and about consumer awareness and protection. And that's my concern. I'm really not that as concerned about a competitive situation with them as much as I'm just concerned about the consumer and what their experience looks like when you have this unregulated industry, and then it's being reflected upon this regulated industry, and the way that we just don't fit together. The competition doesn't need to exist, but it was created by legislative developments and essentially politics. We need to get past it, to be honest with you. We need the hemp industry to come into the fold and either be regulated, either self-regulated or otherwise, and we need it to be more consistent, because their consumer is our consumer, and in these things that are a risk are factors that risk our patients and our consumers as well.
Let me jump in here for a bit, if I could, Pablo. I got a little different spin on that. I think actually the hemp industry has been incredibly damaging to the regulated industry. And, I see that it's incredibly painful what I'm watching in Nevada, where we allow these operators to come in and they skirt the rules. I think one of the ways to rein this in, and I agree with what Robert said, and Michael for that matter, this was a politically created issue. And it's probably going to require a political solution at some point. I think what Governor Newsom did last week with his order, I think sent some shockwaves through the hemp industry, and rightfully so. And I think what Hawaii's doing with some legislation makes sense. My position is it all of this derives from the cannabis plant, as was mentioned. But you know what? You can't have a separate set of rules for one group that is completely unregulated. And look, we test Delta 8 and Delta 9 all the time. We pull from suppliers all over the place and we test. And in every instance, we see, THC levels rivaling what we put out, through the regulated market. So let's not delude ourselves. It has had a dramatic impact on our business and a negative impact. And I think we need to make, an effort as an industry to get the politicians to recognize that they need to change the legislation in every jurisdiction to ensure that if these guys are going to play in the space, they're going to play at the same levels and under the same regulatory constraints that we do. And
let me add to that. The best example I can come up with is what we experience in Texas. So we are one of 3 licensees in Texas, regulated under the program, following all the rules. And we have almost no growth opportunity due to the severe restrictions imposed on us by that regulatory authority. At the same time, that hemp industry has exploded. And they've got vending machines at the airports and so forth. And we too pull it. Not only do we find THC levels, we find metals, we find everything, because this plant is very precarious about as a bioabsorber and biofilter and what it will absorb in the environment. It seeks out these things and accumulates them. And then the processing involves fairly complex extraction mechanisms. It's real science. And if you're not regulated and you're doing it in your basement, you really might end up in a scenario where you're producing regularly a harmful product. And that's my concern. And then you have us being held down when we're trying to do it the right way. And then in the meantime, the market's exploding and the consumer, they don't really know. I mean, in New York, where we just are now, we have to put legal cannabis on the window, but there's 20 illegals either side of us, and they look the same. And so the consumer deception, the legislatures have always tried to protect the consumer. And most of our laws are to protect the people and the unwitting and unknowing from being deceived, except right now. If for some reason there's this idea that we're going to let them do their thing and we're almost scared to hold them in check. We never saw this in any of the other industries. There wasn't an illegal cigarette industry growing around and so forth. So I'm not sure why those responsible for protecting the consumer haven't caught up with this.
But sorry to stay on go ahead, Michael, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that the result of what has happened in the hemp industry should prove to, at least federally, that they should legalize this federally and create those standards nationwide for everybody to operate in a safe market. And so there aren't these differences and these loopholes that were created, really, I think, because of those legislators, when they were originally creating it, had no knowledge of it. They had no clue. I know when they were talking about hemp laws in Florida, they had no clue it could be used for concrete and stuff like that. And they just had, so I think it's a lack of knowledge, and I think they have to federally legalize it and rein it in. This experiment has shown it's not dangerous, and it can extremely benefit this cash poor country right now.
Right. But Michael, the last question on the subject, but do you see a scenario where the governor and the legislature come out with a joint program for hemp derivatives and THC cannabis for adults? Or very unlikely, they are just different rails. One is more federal, one is more state. Do you see a scenario at the state level of a joint program, joint rules, joint oversight, or very unlikely?
So, it would be very interesting because, and that's why this whole No on 3 campaign is crazy, because people have been pushing to open up this market for years. And that's what a lot of these hemp operators want to be in, is they want to be in the cannabis market. And at least the ones that I work with, and so they move to that for process. So I don't know the way that they're talking about no on three. I would think that they're going to open up the system if we pass, when we pass Amendment 3. But, again, for the past 10 years, they have done everything that they can to lock this down. And he mentioned it earlier in that press conference in 2019. DeSantis said at that point that he was going to potentially drop the lawsuits that were trying to open up the market at that point. And he never did. So I don't know. I'm confused.
Yeah, no, understood. Look, I mean, before we move on, one question for you, Michael. Someone is asking here, the amendment says, this amendment shall become effective 6 months after approval by the voters. So that's a quote, right? And the question is, why doesn't approval by the voters occur on November 5th?
My understanding, the effective date is that's a good question. The effective date is the first Tuesday of the month. So that's a good question. If those two words, I know in both with Amendment 2, we were considering that 6 month period from the effective date of the amendment. So.
Right, understood. Look, just moving on to discussion briefly about the current state of the medical market. Robert Groesbeck, I'll start with you. Just remind us of your plans at Vida, the business you acquired there. Are you rebranding stores? How many stores do you expect to have for the end of the year? Are you expanding capacity or waiting for the ballot? And then your read of the current state of the medical market. We put out a note earlier today, talking apparently some a renewed bout of deflation, but your read of the market and remind us of your expansion strategy in Florida, Robert Groesbeck.
Sure. So, look, I think the Florida market is tight. Be curious to see what Robert has to say. I think it's a function primarily of the economy overall. I think a lot of our customers and patients in this case just don't have the disposable income that they had a couple of years ago. Seeing that in Las Vegas too, our flagship operation. I mean, people are still coming to the city; they're just not spending as much, and that's pretty evident. Our goal is to continue to move. Kind of like Robert said earlier, we're going to continue to grow in the medical market. It currently exists. So, as I said on the outset, we've currently opened 28 stores. We've got we should be at 32 open by the end of the year, with the objective to continue to grow at a pretty robust level. We've got significant expansion going on our Jacksonville facility. We are going to build in an indoor component with that. We've got some production upgrades that are underway, a lot of technology upgrades. It's an interesting climate to grow cannabis in, particularly in a greenhouse environment. So, we realize that, we need to, better augment our supply chain and lines, to protect against the degradation in the summer. This is a very harsh environment, particularly to grow in midsummer. So it's continued growth, continued efficiency. Automation is a big part of what we do, so we're implementing a lot of that in our facilities, and then just upgrading the storefronts, to really get transition out of the VitaCam brand into the Planet brand. So it's taken quite a bit of time. We closed the deal in May. We still haven't had all the stores approved for changeovers. So, we're doing the best we can with OMMU to get that accomplished. But, slowly but surely we're getting there.
Okay. 2 quick follow-ups there. So if we get rec in Florida, how many superstores could you have in the state? I mean, what cities I'm talking like Las Vegas size.
Right. Yeah. So assuming the question passes, we'll be looking at one of the 3 largest metro markets. As I've said before, it'd be Metro Miami, Orlando, and the Tampa St. Pete area. So those types of operations only make sense where you've got a huge number of tourists coming through. So we're excited about that. We've been looking at potential locations for several years now. So it's just a question of what happens in November. So.
Right. And look, just a question here for the 3 of you. I know we've talked about what the new program could look like, and we don't know, of course, but could wholesale be allowed? Or do you think we'll keep this vertical model? Or we don't know?
Well, I don't know. I'd be curious what the other guys think here. I hear that chatter all the time that they're going to open up parts of the market, but I haven't seen that anywhere in legislation. So be curious what my colleagues think.
Right. And look, I mean, Robert Beasley or Michael, if you want to opine on that, but also relate. So two questions. One, could we have wholesale in Florida? And I know, we have to see what the new rules could look like, if there are new rules. But the other one is that those 22 new licenses, it's going to be a while for those people to be able to be up and running, right? So you would think that, it takes them 2 to 3 years to be up and running. But any quick thoughts on that?
So, we're in states that allow wholesale, and it's interesting the effect of that on leveling out inventory and actually pricing. It was said by Robert a minute ago that it's a challenging environment. It's a very challenging environment to grow in, and the idea of having a crop that's impacted seasonally. We all go down at some point. We all have losses at some point, and scarcity comes to each of us in turn. And so we do have the crop loss program, which is administered, and it allows some when there's evidence of provable loss. But sometimes you don't have a loss; you just have decreased yields due to stress and so forth and so on. And so it's not the type of loss that's permitted. Wholesale would be helpful to the operators. It would level out the amount of inventory in the state. I think the consumer would actually benefit from that. I do not think that it's going to be permitted. I do not think, from the beginning, remember, we were called monopolies and cartels on the first day. From the beginning, the idea of us cooperating has been, really leaned against. And as a result, it's interesting because the operators don't cooperate. It's crazy that we only recently have come together in the same room to talk about a common issue, and that was Amendment 3. Before then, we were almost scared to talk to each other. Now, I know the Planet 13 guys and their leadership, and but behind the scenes, we kind of talk shop, if you would. But there's no on its face cooperation between these entities in Florida because we're scared to. Because we're scared to be pointed at as a monopoly, and because we're scared to be pointed as a cartel. And so I don't even know that we're pushing for wholesale, although it would level the business out a little bit and make the ups and downs a little bit easier to deal with regard to growing in a very, very difficult environment. Cannabis doesn't like wet feet or excessive moisture, and we have both. It's, recently someone asked me, do I have any pests there? I said, we have all of them. We collect them, every single one of them we have, and we have programs for that, and we factor it in. But it's a tough environment to grow in. So I'd like to see it. Don't think it's going to happen.
All right, Michael, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And again, it really depends on whether or not they mean any of this rhetoric they're saying to use against the No on 3 campaign as to what they do with this industry. I think horizontal, or not horizontal, at a minimum, wholesale is going to be needed when we go to adult use, just for the supply and demand issue. I think it's going to be extremely difficult for these entities to exist and to have a wider range of products for people. I think it's going to be very difficult. And we've seen shortages in multiple different states. I think Massachusetts, they just changed the ferry law so they could bring ferry weed across in the ferry or something like that so that they could get it there because there wasn't enough supply. So I think they're going to have to do something. And that may be the biggest probably problem for the market is servicing the industry once it gets to wreck.
But
I said on a panel last week that it's going to be like having your son's birthday party and 100 extra guests show up for cake. So it's a good problem to have, but it's not a good problem from the consumer perspective. We want to meet the consumer demand as a whole, not just our stores, but as a whole. And if we think about the perspective here, we have 890,000 customers in this state that we're all sharing. The population of Florida is 21 million, 80 million visitors, 56 million eligible customers. So go from 890,000 to 56 million. And that's a massive, massive jump. It'd be like drinking from a fire hose a little bit. And it's going to take some ramp up. And like I said earlier, at least our company, we can't afford to bet on it. So we can't ramp now. So we're going to have to catch it. And so if we were in a wholesale environment, it would level it out and it would let that ramp go smoother for everyone. But if it's not allowed, then we're all going to have to just grow in the unequal way that we've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, it's I don't want to say it's a loose situation for the governor, but it's like the more restrictive he keeps it, the better the economics for the industry. The more he expands it, as you were saying, to balance supply and demand, he's expanding the availability of cannabis. Does he want that, right? So it's like, maybe I shouldn't use the word lose-lose, but it's a bit of a game of chess. I don't see how there's just a natural contradiction there. Any thoughts there?
The operators that exist today are capable of meeting the need and the demand. It's just a growth curve. I don't know that letting more operators in changes that dynamic in the 0 to 3 year term because of the ramp up that's required. The infrastructure to be fully vertical. I mean, we're 4 or 5 companies in one, and we do it well, but only after failing for the last 5 or 6 years. We're a shipping company, we're a packaging company, we're a cultivation company, and so it's to get all of that infrastructure, all those cultural divides together, and all of that mixture together and working in the right direction takes a minute. And so these 22 that come in, even in a rec environment, again, in a medical environment, I think there's no possible way I think that I would take on that challenge. But in a rec environment or an adult use environment, when the demand's available, to get to that demand is still going to take a couple of years. And so those who are here now are going to have to serve this demand for a while. And we can. I believe we can. I think, especially like Planet 13, and we've all been to Planet 13 in Vegas, and it's all our dream model of what we want a store to look like one day. I'd love to have a Planet 13 store on every corner, but they know how. They've been there. They've been at scale. They can get there. We can get there, and so we're about to recapitalize. We're going to get there before those new 22 licenses get there, but it's still going to take us a minute.
Got it. Look, just moving on the discussion to the subject of M&A, right? If the ballot passes, do you expect to see more M&A? There are some companies that may be a bit financially stretched that could be sellers. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to speak for them, but Robert Groesbeck and Robert Beasley, your thoughts in terms of how M&A may play out in the state? Could you be buyers yourselves, or do you pretty much stick to what you have and grow organically? I'll start with you, Robert Groesbeck.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, our plate's pretty full just digesting the VidaCann transaction. Does that mean we'd look at another operator maybe to consolidate? Yeah, if the terms were right. But it is going to be an interesting play because, as Robert he nailed it actually. Coming into the market and trying to build up infrastructure from the ground up is incredibly costly and time consuming. So new entrants into the market where I tread very carefully. But for those of us that are here now that have built scale, we're fortunate that we were able to secure the VidaCann asset. But let me tell you, there were a lot of sleepless nights when we were trying to build this from the ground up. We secured our Summerfield grow location and started building out stores. A lot of time, a lot of capital. And, building at that pace would take years, to really create any mass. So, yeah, for us, the M&A made perfect sense. Would we like to further expand? Again, I'm happy to look at any opportunity that makes sense, and it's accretive. But I don't see a lot of that by virtue of just the light switching on in November, if that's the case. Particularly with these other licenses out there that are yet to issue.
Thank you. Same question for Beasley. Yeah.
I agree. I actually think the VidaCann deal was probably the last first generation deal that was worth doing, and I think the timing that they pulled it off was probably right. It's prospect of the amendments on the horizon, but not here yet. There's a lot of operators that have clearly invested a lot more on this happening than us, and they're stretching to get there, and when they get there. And after they've received the big ticket, it's going to be very expensive to try to buy them. And so M&A is now, or you probably missed it already. And then we've got a lot of good operators out there. I think there's probably 2 that I can think of that could flip out into an M&A environment, and it looks like they're positioning themselves to. But then you got to think about who the buyers would be. Most of the big players are in, and so it would take. Post Amendment 3 being successful, it would take a pretty good checkbook to make a transaction in Florida. And so who would that be? Who are the likely candidates? And it's There's not many. There's not many. We reached a point about a year and a half ago where we became a little too big to digest by even the bigger players. And once you get over that threshold of size, your market becomes very small with buyers. And so I think there's not that many. There's no first generation sale deals anymore in Florida. Everybody's in their second or third generation, and those who've made it to the finish line, they're casting across it here in a few days. They're going to expect a higher market price than probably is going to be worth the return in the short term.
Right. Thank you. Look, I mean, I know we're almost out of time here, but I'm going to ask some very quick questions in terms of national reform level. But Michael, the question for you would be, does the presidential outcome in any way impact the clout of Governor DeSantis? I mean, obviously he remains a governor, but if Trump loses, does that strengthen him and increase his clout and influence with the legislature? If Trump wins, does it weaken him? Any quick thoughts on that?
I guess it depends on what DeSantis is going to do after he leaves governor, because he terms out in 26. But he has pretty much had a stronghold on that legislature for years in the composition of it. So I think pretty much, what he wants is usually kind of what he gets in that legislature, regardless of what happens on the presidential level. Unless, I mean, maybe DeSantis gets some sort of cabinet seat or something like that and starts to move up. And then, he probably has more power. It all depends, I think, on what his plan is in the future.
Okay. Robert, for both Robert Groesbeck and Robert Beasley, if we get rescheduling, remind us of the benefits for your company if you want to quantify them. I'll start with you, Robert Groesbeck.
Yeah, I mean, rescheduling is massive. It, for our company and probably Robert's as well, 280E right now represents about a 23% tax penalty. So just imagine, that going to your bottom line now, from an operational standpoint, and then have the ability, obviously, to take standard deductions and things like regular businesses do. It's going to be a game changer, not only for our company, but I think the industry, and it's long overdue. And I think once that falls into place, the next catalyst will fall. It's roughly the same time will be safe banking or some semblance of that. Again, either of those hitting will be, significant game changers for the entire industry, and I think they're coming, regardless of whether it's Trump or Harris. I think we are going to see some legislation, here in 26 that will help all of us.
Right. Robert Beasley, do you want to quantify the benefits of rescheduling in your case?
Sure, I can list the positives, and that includes the relief of the 280E penalty, the access to capital markets. We borrow in the secondary or tertiary market. I would even say, maybe even from a pawn shop here or there, and our rates are reflective of the risk of our industry, and that risk is almost entirely driven by our illegality. So there's access to capital. There's traditional banking services. We still, there's been an emergence of quite a few green banks or state banks that's helped us out, but we still bank in the shadows a little bit without a full range of services. And the big one for us, when I say that, is the access to our consumers to use credit cards. We're the type of goods that we're more akin to cigarettes and alcohol than anything else. And right now we're limited to the free dollar bills in the consumer's pocket, and we found that to be sub $100 in the current market. And so, no matter what happens, if you only have $50 in your pocket, you're only going to buy $50 worth. Americans live off of their credit, and we don't get access to that and become part of that matrix. And so that would be huge. And then those traditional banking services, and then finally, there is a dark side to it, but I think these upsides far outweigh the risk side. The interplay of the dormant commerce clause, which I haven't actually learned about since law school, but there's an interplay there that enhances trade between the states and lowers the barriers to that. What that does, we mentioned earlier the cost of growing in Florida. It cost us about $14 to grow a gram in Florida, and I used to grow in Oregon. It cost about 6 cents. And so, that kind of movement around the United States of this consumer good, that's going to have a ripple. But I can't see that far. I can see the positives. The underside of it is a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah, no, understood. Look, I know we're out of time. Maybe closing remarks. Michael, I'll start with you. But I guess for you, Michael, the main question probability that we get a yes on 3, right? I think you implied almost 95%, and also your best estimate of when we get start of what we call adult sales, or in Ohio they call them non-medical sales, but it's the same thing.
It's adult use, right? So I do think we're going to get probably around 63% of the vote. We had 71% for medical. And the big thing about that election is that there were more people that voted for marijuana than either President, I think it was Trump at that time, or President Clinton, I think by like 2 million votes. So I think the people in the state of Florida are ready for it. And all the people that came in during COVID and stuff that are in the Republican Party as well, I think a lot of them are supported, So I'm very confident in that yes on. And I think within 6 months, by that June 5th, that they will have adult sales, if not before that, depending on obviously whether or not any of the MMTC owners want to kind of push the legislature at all and kind of see if they're going to be friend or foe to us. And, I do still have people, and I do think there's going to be some M&As with some of those new licenses if they're eventually issued. I definitely have a couple of clients who are looking to get in the space here. So.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Robert Groesbeck, same question. Your estimate, do we get the 60% threshold, and when do reg sales start? And if you want to, pitch your stocks to investors here, go ahead, Robert Groesbeck.
Yeah, let me. I'm going to follow Michael's lead. I hope he's right. I'm optimistic that it does pass, and I'm also very hopeful that what he said as far as the timeline goes falls into place. We're real excited to see that. With respect to our company, we're unique in that we're a cannabis entertainment combined company, and we're traditionally known for our superstores, but we're also now branching out into what we call our neighborhood networks. Florida is a big play in that regard. The company has got a strong balance sheet. We've got very little debt. We're careful, we're prudent, and as Robert indicated at the outset, we're not going to start deploying capital, to run at this adult thing till it actually passes. But we've got plenty of improvements to make just to satisfy the medical market. So we're excited to be here. We're excited about future growth for the company and future growth for the sector. I mean, I think a lot of cannabis stocks are way undervalued, including ours. So it's worth giving a look. Again, I'm bullish. I think things are going to finally start to turn the right direction.
Thank you. And Robert Beasley, please, pitch your stock to investors out there, and your best estimate of the 60% vote, and when we start sales of adult cannabis.
Yeah, we're still on the Canadian exchange. TIUM is the ticker. It's Cansortium. So it's the last 4 digits there of that name. Hoping to change it to FLUENT soon so that we can all better understand it a little bit. But yes, our stock is certainly one of the undervalued ones. We have never had a stock price that even comes close to our actual asset value. And that's because we see it mostly suppressed and controlled by risk, and also these legislative events that we've just talked about. I think it passes. I think it's a natural evolution. Florida is a southern state at heart. It's been enough time now for the medical to be here. People that I have never imagined. I live up in Pensacola in the Panhandle, which is southern Alabama, and people I imagine would never even consider it are now using it and finding and extolling the benefits. It's become accepted, and all the negatives didn't happen. There's not people laid out on the corner, and it didn't gateway itself, and all of those things that were the boogeyman just didn't happen. And now it's been enough time that people are comfortable, and I think it passes. What happens next? We've talked about that here in this scenario. What happens next is what concerns me, and what happens next is when the people say what they want, and then the legislatures. By the way, this is not a constitutional ripe amendment anyway. We should, if 60-something% of the people of Florida really wanted this, and they do evidence that, the legislature should have already passed it, right? Because they're representative of at least 60-something% of the people in Florida. And so we shouldn't be using the Constitution to in-run our representative body. And when we have to do so, it shows you that the process is disproportionately political. And so that's my concern, is we're going to go right into this fire of a body that has failed to cooperate with the will of the people to start with. And so my hesitancy is what happens next.
That's great. Thank you very much. To all our three speakers and everyone, thank you for joining us. You know how to reach us and how to reach the speakers. If you need their emails, reach out to me also. But everyone, have a good day. And again, thank you, Robert Groesbeck, Robert Beasley, and Michael Minardi. Have a good day.
Really enjoyed being with you. Thank you.